Good afternoon. My name is Muniba Isaacs. I'm a professor at the University of Western Cape. Welcome to our PLAS webinar series. This is our 9th webinar series, and our webinar series has been mainly focused on the topic of COVID-19 crisis, voices from civil society, community representatives, and also experts, discussing and raising issues around how the COVID-19 epidemic is affecting poor people, the marginalized in our society. Today, we are moving into a more of an academic seminar, and the academic seminar today is based on fisheries, Black economic empowerment and fisheries, and the topic is, as you can see on the screen, the political economy of competition, regulation and transformation. How does Black economic empowerment and quota allocations in South Africa in the industrial fisheries? Very interesting topic, and basically I'm very pleased to introduce you to two speakers. Our first speaker is Stefano Ponte. Stefano is a professor at the International Political Economy and director of the Center for Business and Development Studies in Copenhagen Business School. Stefano has been with PLAS about 15 years ago, and he spent a year looking into Black economic empowerment from different sectors, the wine sector, but also in fisheries more particular. Stefano is interested in transnational economic and environmental governance, and overlaps with the tensions between private authority, public regulation. Stefano analyze business, government, civil society interactions and governance, and upgrading the trajectory of global value chains. He's currently working on sustainability issues and how to shape power relations in the global value chain. So our lineup today would first be Stefano, but I'm also going to use this to introduce you to Thando. Thando is leading this research, and Thando is a executive. Thando Velakasi is the executive director of the Center for Competition, Regulation and Economic Development at the University of Johannesburg, specializing in academic research, teaching, advice on competition policy, industrial development. He currently also serves as a part-time member of the Competition Tribunal in South Africa. He's worked as an economist on the Competition Commission of South Africa and has led research and provided teaching and advisory services across the economic sectors, both on the continent and abroad. He has a PhD in economics from the University of Johannesburg, and he is currently has published widely and is busy with a book on a co-editor on the book on opening barriers, on opening South African economy barriers to entry, regulation and competition. So Thando and Stefano is basically looking at how does this competition, regulation and transformation impact on the fishing industry. So what we're going to do now, I'm going to get Stefano to I'm going to disappear from the screen, and Stefano will give introductory comments on the research they've done, and then Thando will take it further. I will then come later and give insight and act as a discussant on what has been raised. And please, people, also your comments and questions are welcome. Thank you, Stefano. I'll give it over to you to present. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Muniba. It's nice to be back at PLAS, although virtually this time, and thank you so much for hosting this webinar. The work that Tando and I are presenting today is part of a wider collaboration between the Center for Competition, Regulation and Economic Development, which is the director, also known as CRED, at the University of Johannesburg, and the Center for Business and Development Studies that I'm a director of at Copenhagen Business School. We're working together with a broader group of people on various issues related to competition and value chain dynamics, and how they shape inequality and transformation in South Africa. So in the 15 minutes that we were allocated for the webinar today, we can give you a broad picture of what we are doing and what our main findings are. And we're really looking forward to your questions and the discussion. We're still finalizing a working paper that will be published between the next 2 months. And this seminar is part of the feedback process. Next slide, please. So what we're going to focus today is on the main industrial fishery in South Africa, which is hake deep sea trawl. We're looking back at what happened between 2005, when the last long-term rights allocation took place, but also forward in view of the fishery rights allocation process that was supposed to be finished by this year, but now has been postponed to 2021. Methods were used, interviews in the industry, collection of secondary materials. I did this work in 2004 and 5 in leading to the LTR 2005, and now in the last 4 to 6 months, we've done a lot of catching up, and also with Tando in terms of reaching out to various people in the industry. So we've done a lot of interviews. So I would like to start by saying that we are aware that the hake fishery has been subject to a lot of research in South Africa and internationally. In particular in South Africa, a lot of really good work on environmental sustainability. There have been quite deep and specific studies on its economic profile, including research that has been demanded or contracted by the main industry association. There's also a good bit of research that's been done on the Black economic and empowerment dynamics. And we draw from the results of this previous research, but we also provide 2 novel elements in our effort. So the first element is that we take a deliberate value chain approach. So we don't focus only on the point of resource extraction, so the fishing function, but reflect on other functions downstream as well. So processing, marketing, export, etc. And we do so by analyzing different kinds of power and how they affect inequality. So just to give you a sense of the framework on the table on the right, you don't really need to go through the details, but just to give you an idea. So we apply a framework that I developed with other colleagues in terms of identifying different kinds of power and how they operate in the value chain dynamics. As you can see, there are 2 dimensions. There is power that is transmitted directly or that is more diffuse. And then the other dimension is that power that is transmitted in dyadic forms, one-to-one, or more collective. So the top left box is where most economics, including competition economics, has been focusing on bargaining power. The bottom left part is where a lot of political science and political economy, including law, has been working on in terms of understanding how power relations are. We know a lot less about the right-hand side, and in this working paper, we use all 4 forms to try to understand how different elements overlap and how these kind of different kinds of power come together. And we focus specifically also on constitutive power, which is on the lower right-hand side, in terms of understanding how certain ideas are becoming prominent in terms of how it is the best way of maintaining sustainability. What does it mean to have efficiency? What kind of competition are we looking at? So, and we do the second point that we do that is quite different from work that has been done already in this field is that we combine these three elements of analysis. Okay, As I said before, there's been a lot of work going on fishing rights allocation processes. We engage in that work as well, but we make it talk to issues of competition and market power. And I've been very happy to collaborate with Tando and his team on that, because they have a lot of experience in that. And thirdly, we look at Black economic empowerment and transformation issues. So instead of taking these as separate issues, we bring them together and make them talk to each other. And I think that what we are actually finding is that it provides a more holistic picture of the dynamics of transformation in this particular industry, but they can also be extended to other industries in South Africa as well. And with that, I think I'll pass on the mic to Tando. Thank you.
Thanks, Stefano. Greetings or good afternoon, everyone. So I think we've been quite cautious to manage time here, because we think the value in a session like this, where you've got industry and academia represented and people that are quite knowledgeable in terms of the sector, or many that are, is that the discussion and the Q&A is quite important for our feedback process, but also in testing some of the thinking that's coming through from our assessment. I think that perhaps if there's a wider audience listening, it might be useful to just capture a quick kind of highlights package of how the sector works. So I think this kind of Hake deep sea trawl, which I'll call HDST from here, is the largest industrial fishery in South Africa. And so it's quite significant in terms of what happens in HDST. I think has very important signals and perhaps impact, if you will, on the overall fishing sector, right? And so it's quite an interesting one to look at. Historically, and this is, we're talking 100 odd years here, and even more recent history, you're dealing with essentially about 2 or 3 really large firms in the sector, if you will. A lot of those firms are vertically integrated and would be familiar to many people. Here we're talking about Sea Harvest, we're talking about I&J as brands. At least we would know them quite well. And of course, the third largest is Oceania as a kind of collective. Within the sector, there's a system of regulation, and if you're not aware of the process, at about 2005, there was an allocation of 15-year rights to fishing companies, which give them the right to essentially go and fish a certain quantity of fish, what's called total allowable catch, on an annual basis. And this, but the rights that were issued were actually 15-year rights. And so this period now, 2019, 2020, is actually when these rights are up for renewal or extension or removal in some cases. And so the moment at which we kind of put this research out, I think is quite interesting in that regard as well, and with the hope of shaping some of the debates. What we know about the sector is that there is, the kind of many individual companies, and currently you've got about 33 different rights holders in this subsection of the overall fishing sector. But you also have what they call clusters, if you will. And these are not formalized structures necessarily, but we're talking about different forms, business models of interactions between firms within this group of 33. In some instances, you have a lot of smaller firms, for instance, that contract or partner with a larger entity that has processing facilities, so that once they've caught their fish, they're able to deliver under contract to a particular player that has facilities to do that. And as I mentioned, the larger players are vertically integrated through the sector. There's different formats of this, where you might have a grouping of smaller companies buying up the share of other rights holders, or actually working together so that they can jointly have the economies of scale to run a fishing vessel, which is quite an important dimension of that in the sector. But also to be able to, in some instances, very few instances, be able to have the scale to actually also do some kind of packing and processing activity as well, right? And there's a range of different models, which I think were covered very well in recent SUDSTEER work, which is the industry association, over the last 2 or 3 years. And so we won't go through all of that here. One of the key features of the 2005 allocation process is that after much to and fro from the early 2000s, even the 90s a bit, we arrived at a process which essentially prioritized allocation of a large proportion of the rights, right? So if you say, for instance, there's 100,000 tons per year that must be caught, a larger proportion of that was then allocated to newer entrants or smaller companies in the sector. And so some share was taken away, if you will, from the kind of big 2 or big 3, depending on the dimension you're talking about, right? And this was essentially the representation from a policy perspective of what transformation would look like. We would reallocate rights to fishing activity so that smaller players can come into the sector, hopefully buy vessels, hopefully start to fish, hopefully become viable entities within the sector. The question we ask, because I think a lot of what I've said is not new just yet, is what has been the experience when we look back over 15 years of these smaller and medium-sized rights holders, right? And I think this is quite interesting and important from a range of different perspectives, not only socially, and obviously in the South African context, this question of inclusion, of inequality is quite important. But it's also interesting because of broader debate about inequality, right? So ownership of assets, of productive assets in the economy, the ability from a competition perspective to compete and contest markets rather than simply be, for instance, a fronting BEE shareholder. And I think we've all heard a lot about that in the media over the last kind of 20 years, if you will, as well. There are a range of different forces at play as well in the sector, maybe not to call them forces, but there's also a kind of wider external environment. So the international market over time has evolved to value certification, environmental standards, traceability, etc., right, and protection of the fishing resources in different countries, right? And so if you are able to sign on to standards and qualify for standards such as this MSC standard that's on the slide, then it also essentially allows you to enter into more sophisticated or demanding markets in terms of those types of things, right? So European markets, North American markets. In the South African case, the industry has effectively brought itself together in the early 2000s to apply for the certification and then receive the certification, and then there's a process of renewal every few years. Right? This is quite important because it puts a very important stamp or branding stamp, if you will, eco-labeling on South African fish in international markets. That process largely, though, is funded by the industry, and so there's important questions about what it implies for inclusion and exclusion within the sector more broadly. What we do know is that it has, in many ways, had an important positive impact in terms of protecting the resource that we're talking about. Maybe just lastly to mention, as I lead into the slide, is that there's also then been let's not say quite a few, but a few BEE deals, etc., and merger and acquisition transactions, and a few competition cases in this space, which allow us to enter and introduce this question of competition even within the framework and lens that we're talking about that Stefano described. I'll say a few things here that I think, some of which may be different, but are largely commonplace. The first is that I think this is an industry where, and it's the type of industry, especially when dealing with a valuable natural resource, where you don't inherently expect competition to function as you would in a market for a commodity, a fast-moving commodity good product, for instance, like bread or something, or where there's differentiation, the types of goods we would buy in our homes. This is an industry that's characterized by substantial scale economies, and so it does matter if you can, as a company, amass sufficient scale in terms of your operations, and in this case, in terms of your allocated share of the fishing rights, to be able to actually achieve economies of scale and make production and fishing activity viable. This is not debatable. I think the economics on that is quite clear. But what we wanted to introduce to this debate, and we deal with this in the paper, which will be shared at some point, is that often in those markets, it's a very strong argument, and I think the industry has advanced this as well, against fragmentation, for instance. So an argument towards consolidation so that you can have fewer entities with the scale to compete viably in international markets, or even to make their operations viable here within the local market, right? But I think what the literature shows us, and I think even a South African experience, and to use an example here in the cement industry, where you also had an industry that was characterized by economies of scale, etc., and it was quite important for the industry to be able to coordinate and to limit rivalry, to limit entries, etc., so that they could remain viable in terms of economies of scale. But what we've learned from studies of that sector is that that doesn't necessarily mean that that there shouldn't be some form of competitive discipline on the conduct of firms within the sector. Right? We argue in the paper that in the absence of disciplines of some form, so this is not necessarily another large rival entering the sector, but other disciplines either through regulation or, for instance, exposure to international markets, etc., then the efficiencies that the firms accumulate from having the scale economies, from having a larger allocation of the total allowable catch, will not pass through to the market. They will be probably withheld. There's no incentive for firms to make ultimately fishing products in the domestic market cheaper, or to give better terms of trade to smaller entities that are supplying fish to them, because there's no competition. Right? And so there needs to be some form of discipline, which you don't necessarily see when we assess the sector. There's, of course, also a very strong theme in terms of consolidation, of collusion, or let's not call it collusion. There was a collusion case in pelagic fish and not in hake. But there is this kind of close industry interaction through the industry association, etc. And what this simply means is that there's quite a bit of transparency between the larger players. And ordinarily, at least in terms of the theory, you expect then a dampening of rivalry between the firms in there. They may still be competing to some extent, but you may not expect that they would compete, for instance, in the same way that firms that were completely strategically independent would compete. And so this question of BEE fits in quite nicely here, because then you kind of ask, I mean, the government set the targets, and many South Africans would know the story around BEE and how it works and all of that, to say we want to achieve, or we want companies to achieve certain outcomes in terms of the BEE scorecards, right? And so the scorecards are set. And in fact, this is a sector where the performance of the companies on the BEE scores is quite good. I think the stat now is that from about 30% black ownership of the leading or of the largest weighted share of total allowable catch belonging to black shareholders in 2005, that's evolved substantially, and now you're talking about upwards of 65%, in fact, depending on which combination of companies you're talking about, right? And so what happened is that we set the target, we set the exam, and the industry has passed, and I think this has to be recognized. And not kind of pushed aside as in having these debates. It's important to be quite balanced here. But then we need to understand the substance of transformation here. Right? So was it the intention or the kind of envisaged view of transformation that transformation would simply be accomplishments in terms of ownership or the BEE scorecards, or did we expect or want a deeper form of transformation here, right? So what we asked them and what we found is that, for instance, the experiences of BEE partners in some of the deals have not necessarily been that good in terms of the terms of trade or their involvement in these deals, but also in terms of their integration at different parts of the value chain, right? So in many ways, you have a blackening of ownership, if you will, in the sector. You have improvements in terms of local procurement or procurement from SMMEs and black-owned firms, etc. But the nature of that, the question about whether you've developed sustainable new entrants and black-owned rivals in the sector still remains. And our understanding from the industry and from speaking to SMMEs is that this hasn't been as good. Most SMMEs we spoke to in our process don't tell a good story of having received allocation through the policy framework in the early 2000s and actually operating in a sector where they've seen themselves be able to take risks, invest, compete in the market and grow, right? And many of them are still relegated to operating at the margins. And this is really concerning. So maybe to bring things together here, and I hope that the questions will allow us to go back to some of the points that we've raised and maybe skimmed over. I think the value chain framework does allow us to zoom out a little bit in terms of analyzing the different dimensions of power in the sector. And this is important. I think a narrow focus, for instance, on only parts of the value chain or only parts of understanding the sector, for instance, on this question of sustainability, misses the fact that the issues of sustainability, eco-labeling, etc., are in fact linked to the dimensions of dependency and bargaining power in the sector of smaller players, which in turn are also linked to the dimensions of competition, vertical integration, etc. Right? And so these things all kind of fit together. If you will, our cross-cutting insight here is that in many ways, the competition law on the one hand, but also BEE and even the FRAP process, each of those considered separately has done its job as a piece of legislation, as a regulatory intervention, right? The BEE scores look great in the sector and improving. The second largest firm is essentially a black-owned firm through Brimstone's shareholding in it, Sea Harvest. And again, the FRAP process did allocate rights to smaller players, etc. The competition law has been has looked quite closely at mergers, but only done what it can do within its powers, right? But the question then is, and what we find really is that the question of substantive inclusion of smaller, medium-sized players in particular, right? So we're not talking about a proliferation of thousands of players here. We're talking about a few strong rivals emerging, has fallen through the cracks. And I think that's because of a limited understanding of what it actually takes of those companies to enter, to compete, to grow in the sector, right? So entry was fine, but expanding, surviving is quite a different question, right? Which leads us really to a bigger, broader question, which we hope we can discuss here, about what does transformation 2.0 look like, if you will. So what do we expect? What form of transformation does SA Inc. want out of this sector, right? I think the process that's been followed could be argued to have been necessary to introduce new players into the sector in the first 15 years. But I think we're at a landmark now where you might actually say, okay, good. So can we advance the agenda further? Can you make a more inclusive sector where you actually have new emerging rivals that can contest the market? We would argue that that's a far better form of transformation when you consider the broader questions of inequality and inclusion in the economy. I think I'll leave it there. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much, Thando, and thank you very much, Stefano, for your inputs. For me, in terms of transformation in fisheries, I have a quote from the late Roy Bross, who I interviewed many years ago. He was the chairperson of the deep sea hake trawling industry. And he basically told me, Muniba, he said, transformation is politics. And it would create deconcentration of rights to accommodate many new entrants into the fishing industry to achieve equity and economics, and has created a concentration of right holders. This happened in 1991 with annual allocations up to 2006 with the medium and long-term allocations. And this will happen again with the next allocation process. So when we look at the ITQ system and we look at the individual transferable right system as a process of allocating fishing rights, you're basically asking the economy, the privatization of the fisheries to be able to look at transforming the sector. So the rationale for Black economic empowerment is surely that we're looking at, when we look at Black economic empowerment, it's not necessarily including many smaller players. And that's why the cluster, the concentration of the cluster that you mentioned, Thando, is very prevalent in the sector. Currently, the sector has about between 33 or 52 players in the hake sector, and if you look at the clustering of the companies, you look that it goes back to the big fishing companies, whether it is INJ cluster, whether it is the Oceana cluster, or whether it is the Sea Harvest cluster that you have. And if you want to kind of look in terms of equity, I mean, you cannot use an ITQ system of rights allocation to achieve equity, and this is for me problematic in practice, and it is incompatible with transformation. It might be, as your conclusion is saying, it might be compatible with Black economic empowerment, because Black economic empowerment has mainly just seen that that the company specs are more broader in terms of of gender and in terms of race, not so much on gender, but in terms of, as you call, I don't necessarily like the word blackening, but as you call, in terms of looking at Black economic empowerment. So the sector in itself for the smaller players is challenging, and I have heard smaller players in a year ago saying that we are now big enough, we can get bigger quotas. It is also about the viability of the quota that they are received. Because if you are looking at what is the tonnage for the bigger companies compared to what is the tonnage for the smaller companies, it's problematic in itself. It's not economically viable. Thereby the clustering is a big issue, why smaller players are resorting to cluster. You mentioned briefly that the sector is there's a very close co-management set up in this sector, led by the association, and then also with the industry, and to a large extent, the unions also bought into the Black economic empowerment of this sector. Then it's strongly supported by science. Together with that, it's also supported with marine certification, Marine Council certification. So you also have the Responsible Alliance that are featured in the sector. So you have the sustainability. On the one hand, we tick the box in terms of sustainability. On the other hand, we tick the box in terms of in terms of Black economic empowerment. And we tick the box in terms of running efficient companies. These companies are vertically and are horizontally integrated, which makes it very difficult for those who want to get into the sector to survive with quotas that are not really viable. Most of the people may know me for working in the small scale sector, but as a researcher back in 1995, 1996, I started really looking at the quota allocations, and the one word that came across throughout my research was either you are a paper quota holder, you sit on your couch and you wait for money to come into your account, or you become a cardboard quota holder, which means that you are now engaged in a joint venture agreement. And these clusters are also, in essence, let's just call it out. These clusters, I don't necessarily know to what extent they are really part of the operations of the company. Are they only part of the capture of the fisheries, the harvesting? To what extent are they part of the processing and the marketing? And it's actually there where most of the money comes in this particular sector. It is the processing and the harvesting. And I think it's interesting that your study is impacting or focusing on the processing side, because it's the processing side where you really in terms of and a lot of the processing, I must say, throughout this in terms of transformation has also been mechanization, has been a key part, which also means that the mechanization of the operations, getting bigger vessels, and these vessels are easily up to 100 million, or maybe 10 to 20 million cost to purchase these vessels, and it's very capital intensive for the smaller players with unviable quotas to really compete in terms of the vessels. Now moving your operations on onshore in terms of the vessels, what impact does that have on the smaller players who are in this particular sector? And I think it is these power dynamics that I think that you are raising in your paper, that I think it is important, between the ones who are part of that cluster as maybe just paper quota holders, let's call it out, or to what extent are they really part of the decision-making process? And this you get across the spectrum of Black economic joint venture agreements. What inputs do they have in that particular sector is important. I think it's also important to note that the Black economic scorecards is almost a formula, and the formula in terms of to what extent your company has been transformed. If you really look at the sector, most of the people who work in the sector in terms of onshore and offshore are people of either in terms of are Black, when we talk in the broad spectrum of South Africa. But when you look at top management, maybe there are speckles of Black in top management, and more so now than before. But I think it's also important that we look at to what extent has management, middle management, top management, and within the boards has changed in terms of the of Black economic empowerment, and I think it is important that we look in we look in terms of the reform of the sector. And one thing that comes to mind, and this is where I will end, is that the main narrative in terms of fisheries reform throughout the last 20 to 25 years. You touch our quotas, we will cut jobs. But in the end, jobs had been cut because of mechanization. I think that for me, I was trying to understand how many people work in the sector. And it's very difficult to understand how many people really work in the sector in terms of decent jobs. And that is where I will leave it. Stefano and Thando, if you can come back and maybe just give your first take on that, and then I will see what are the questions that are coming from the live comments.
Thank you very much, Muniba, for your comments and very interesting insights. Maybe if it's okay, Thando, we'll take one or two and then get you to answer some of the others. I wanted to clarify one thing about what you had mentioned about privatization of fisheries and the ITQs. We need to remember that the quotas in South Africa are not transferable automatically, so you cannot put them in the open market. So in between allocations, you can, if you wish, transfer quotas, but that needs to be cleared out by the ministry. So it's not a pure ITQ system at all, or not to that extent. And you have long-term allocation process in which all sorts of different dynamics and dimensions come into place. So fishery sector, in view of understanding transformation of Black economic empowerment, it's very interesting for me in particular because it's one of the most highly regulated and controlled sectors. And so if you can and want to achieve something politically here, you can because of the level of control that you have. At the same time, because it's an industrial fishery, capital intensive, there is a limitation on which you can expand the entry into smaller entities, because then you hit questions of economies of scale, etc. Having said that, what we bring in, I think, we highlight two elements, and I'll perhaps focus on the first one, which is a lot of the debates has been going on only at the level of fishing. And of course, that is very important. But it's also the place where the margins are smaller. As you move along the value chain, the money is made and the value added, let's say, is placed elsewhere. Differently from what I did 15 years ago when I talked to all the big players and the industry association, et cetera, Tando and I this time decided to dedicate more time to talk to the smaller and medium rights allocation holders of rights, in order to understand what is the perspective of what is going on, both in terms of the joint ventures in fishing, but beyond that, what's happening with or not happening with processing. And a lot of what we found, or the views that we found out from the bottom up, is that, well, first of all, it's actually quite difficult to get into processing as competitors, because the existing big companies are very sophisticated. They put in a lot of capital, etc. And that is obviously a reasonable situation. But they also said those who are in joint ventures at the fishing level with the bigger companies have been trying to push to also enter the processing side as partners. So that has been pushed back in one way or another so far. Therefore, there's a gate that comes up there because it's not controlled by the fishery allocation process. Then it comes into a completely different kind of political realm, and that part hasn't really happened, and that is where the value is. So that's one element that we bring in our work. The second element is, and I'll leave it to Tando on this, is what does it mean to have the big players that have become definitely blacker in some of the dimensions of Black economic empowerment, vis-a-vis have middle-sized players that have been operating in this sector for now 15, 20 years to become viable competitors there. We understand that in this industrial fishery, you really need to have a minimum quota to be able to operate. And a lot of the joint ventures, there are all different kinds of ways. Pure paper quota holders are not really there anymore, even though there was at the beginning. Right now, a lot of the quota holders are involved in one way or another in operations. But what we're missing is that sort of the competitiveness in the sector that we are not observing. And maybe I'll leave this to Tando, and then I'll come back maybe later if there are more issues to be discussed.
Maybe just to add here and pick up on a few issues that you raised, Chair. I mean, Muniba, that you raised. I think it's important to also just frame this appropriately as well, just building on what you're saying. I think that the question of, transformation as politics, right, is actually not something to be, that we should, as kind of analysts, as South Africans, as anyone, really be uncomfortable with. I think that in any country, in the sector, or in any other economic sector, there's constant interplay between political and economic incentives of different actors. You have the state, which has economic and political interests all the time, and you have businesses that have both economic and political interests. And by political, we're not talking about necessarily, do they fund a political party? The question is, what is their interest? How does it line with the bottom line if you're talking about businesses? And what agendas do they want to push in the sector to protect the different interests that they have, right? And this is commonplace in any sector. So I think it shouldn't alarm us that there is lobbying behavior, that there is industry groups that push an agenda that favors them. I think what's interesting in this sector, though, is that the question, or at least the question we raised, is the question is, what is the orientation of the influential groups? Right? So if there are groupings of firms, if it's about large firms caballing, if you will, to achieve certain outcomes, in which direction do they direct that? Are they pro-developmental outcomes that arise, right? And to some extent, one might argue, and we try to be quite balanced about this because I think it's important, we argue that, well, actually, there has been investment in the sector and there has been employment creation, right? And it's kind of 7,000 jobs in there. There's a lot of good stats that were produced in the recent study. And obviously on BEE, the scores have improved across the board, etc. Right? The question is, what does that tell us about how effective the regulatory infrastructure has been? Did we set the right benchmarks in terms of what we wanted the industry to achieve? Because they've clearly achieved what was set up before, at least in the BEE framework. And does that need to change going forward? Right? Does the orientation in the sector need to shift to one that, for instance, is more open to inclusion, particularly of dynamic medium-sized firms that are actually able to make investments and contest in the sector. I think one thing we didn't mention earlier is that we are seeing that there aren't many, but there are some firms that have actually worked really hard to make substantive investments in vessels, acquisition of allocation, etc., in this sector, but also in adjacent fisheries as well. What this tells us is that an argument for inclusion doesn't have to be an argument against efficiency in the sector. You can have entrants that grow to a sufficient size that they actually can be viable contributors in the sector, so you have inclusion, but actually that can, over time, if you give them sufficient scale, allocation, etc., could maybe grow to contest at least some niche markets in the overall sector, right? And all this does is not that you want to create necessarily another large firm that can compete. This is not the objective. The question is, on the margins, is there sufficient competitive discipline on the large insiders in the sector so that even where they derive efficiencies, these are passed through to consumers, and that they have the incentive to continue to find ways to derive efficiencies as well, right? So we try to move the narrative a bit from a kind of polar one to thinking more deeply about how you could tweak the rules of the game, if you will, to have even better outcomes, if you will, or better outcomes, if you will, in the next 15 years once this allocation has taken place. Thanks, Chair.
Moniba, you're muted. We cannot hear you.
Is that better? You can hear me now? Good.
Yeah.
Okay. Stefano, I think it's the semantics when we're talking about whether, the quota is transferable and how in terms of a little bit of the rules. I think for me, it's the privatization that is the problem. In terms of the quota, but I do see there's an incompatibility in terms of broadening using an let's call it an ITQ system of allocation compared to in terms of the incompatibility between that system and trying to achieve broad-based Black economic empowerment. That I think is my particular issue. I'm going to ask Bangi in the background to lift a comment, and you will see it on the banner. Bangi? Okay, then I'm going to read the comment. Albi Kader asked the comment very early on in terms of Black economic empowerment. His question is, do you believe that broad-based Black economic empowerment has benefited the fishing industry, especially those that broad-based Black economic empowerment was supposed to benefit? It's more or less the same question that I'm asking, whether it really benefited those. So if we can just shortly answer that question. Tando, maybe you first and then Stefano. Thank you. Can't hear you.
I'm not muted anymore. There you go. I think it's a bit of a mixed picture and a very interesting question, right? So if you look at the 2013 amended kind of BE scores, they look at those 5 criteria, which I think is ownership, management control, enterprise development, social development, and something, I think it's management control. The scores of the companies as reported in their annual report, as reported by EmpowerDex in recent studies as well, show that there's been improvement in each of these areas, right? And presumably the improvement is implicitly a reflection of the fact that whereas there were maybe one Black-owned supplier or SME supplier in the value chain, there are now 5, right? So I think there has been some kind of quantitative increase in each of these areas. And the footnote there is obviously changes in scorecards over time, etc. Right? I think the real question is the weighting between these changes, right? So if you have a kind of soft policy where compliance wasn't always kind of enforced, if you will, and maybe to some extent still isn't, right? Then it means that some of those outcomes, although they look good in the numbers, are substantively not where you might want them to be. Right? In that, if you ask us, at least in terms of what we say in the paper, transformation, as we know it, might actually evolve or need to evolve in this next era in the sector and I think nationally even, to now incorporate a deeper understanding of what it actually takes to participate, right? A deeper understanding of what does it mean to be, to have a large firm procure from a smaller entity in the sector, right? What are the actual terms of trade that large firm procures from that entity as well, right? Because remember in the scorecard, it doesn't say, do you offer the SMME a good price for their fish? It says, do you buy from the black-owned SMME, right? And if you do, it ticks. Question is, what is the price? Do you offer them a price that allows them to be viable, to make investments, to try and grow, to employ people over time? I think that's the kind of substantive questions that we really want to talk about. And so maybe if we're talking about transformation in that sense and be in that sense, my own view is that we maybe haven't gone far enough and there's more to do in that space. But if you're talking about BE in the narrow sense as framed by the legislation, in this and other sectors, there has been some progress. Question is whether we had set the right goalpost in the first place, I suppose, through the policy. Thanks, Jim.
I think I just wanted to add one dimension, that is, what you have is instruments that are operating in one particular point of the value chain. So you have competition policy and the competition cases, you have the FRAP allocation process, you have the BE scorecards, and they look at one particular place. And then you find out what kind of outcomes there are. And then that is completely separate from the rest of the value chain. And so what is missing is a regulatory system that can bring the value chain and the various aspects and to what extent you have control or not, or the operations and value chain nodes where a lot of the value is created, vis-a-vis the taking one bit at a time and keeping it separate. So a systemic approach, and I'm implicitly answering some of the other comments that I've seen in the live comments. So missing that, it's essentially you're taking the big tsunami, you take a tiny slice, which is where the small margins are, and over there you look really carefully about these kind of dynamics, while the rest of the value you just leave it as it is, and therefore there's a mismatch between the returns that are involved in that and the attention and the instruments that are applied to.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to ask Bangi to lift another question for us. This question is coming from a student who's doing his PhD, Tsele Ntane, and thank you for tuning into our webinars. The question is about concentration and vertical integration, industrial fisheries, harvest rights to processing, and intentionally complex milieu. How could legislation force a disaggregation of these monopolies? Stando, would you want to start, and then Stefano? And I think it is also, I'll see if we can fit in another question. So we have about 7 minutes left. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I wonder if it's, and I'm pretty sure it's not for us to answer, unfortunately, as to whether, I certainly couldn't answer as to whether there should be, vertical disaggregation of the sector, etc. Right? I think on the one hand, you do have to recognize the nature of the resource and kind of implicit importance of the economies of integration, the coordination and elimination of double margins and things through the value chain that takes place when you have vertical integration. Right? So the question is it's not for me whether you have vertical integration or not. The question is, where you have vertical integration, do the benefits pass through as you would have expected? Right? Are you achieving, is it helping, or can it be used to shape the type of outcomes that you want to shape, right? And the question is, and then there's a real question about whether we know that what the types of outcomes that we want to shape are. What I would say, though, on the question of, whether you of vertical integration, etc., is maybe a broader question about where is the industrial financing that is prepared to fund multi-level entry into the sector, at processing, at fishing, etc. Right? Coordinated programmed finance and industrial policy support that would actually allow for organic growth of challenger firms in the sector. I think these are the more interesting questions. Is there a coordinated policy approach that says, maybe upon reflection says, maybe we haven't gotten as far as we wanted to get to in terms of transformation, but we recognize the gains, we recognize the value that the industry currently adds, and they've made investments, they've employed people, but we want to take it further. We want to be having a different conversation in 15 years' time. And if so, what do we need to do in a coordinated form, and not in the form of BE on the one hand, then competition law on the other, and then the MLRA on the other hand, in a very disjunct way. But are there ways in which these different policies can speak to each other so that you can have outcomes which we would argue are more desirable? That is, a market that is certainly at least open to the emergence of new challenger firms at the fringes of the current larger players that operate. I think those are the kind of interesting questions. And I think there's maybe one more point to make here, which is that in any event, even if we set a new target in terms of what, and some of the questions speak to, how would you reform the policy then? Regardless of how we frame that, it still remains important that we monitor and evaluate what happens. I think a clear message from our interviews is that no one was watching to some degree. We allocated quotas as a society. We included players, we gave people the chance to participate. And then no one was watching, especially on the socio-economic impact side. And then the FRAP process started coming up. A lot of companies start investing so that they're ready to get a bit more allocation, because the allocation looks at BE, looks at investments made, etc. So what have you done with your quota? There's a bit of scrambling that goes on, but now there isn't really a good body of evidence that says, well, more broadly at the level, not just at the level of the big firms, what have we achieved? What have the companies that we gave quotas to achieved? What has been the socio-economic impact at the company level, but also at the community level? Whatever we do policy-wise going forward, it'll be very important that there's more state capacitation in terms of monitoring and evaluating those outcomes, and making adaptive changes along the way instead of waiting 15 years, where we see that outcomes are not coming out as we would expect them. I think that would be the broader policy guidance, I suppose, that our analysis points to, although that, of course, is also debatable.
I'll just add one more minute. I think there are two elements that need to be looked at from a regulatory perspective, but also a research perspective, okay? One is, so you have a mixed system. You have the big vertically integrated companies that at the same time also have joint ventures with others who don't have enough allocational quota. And in those joint ventures, very often we've been working together for 10, 15 years, some good stories of engagement in management, many others, essentially you're a passive sort of player in that. And not only that, a lot of time passes without any dividends being paid. So that's one form of exploitative relationships that we picked up at the fishing level. If you then bring in the vertical dimension, the sort of the value chain dimension, there's also that. If you're only operating at the fishing level with the joint venture, one of the big firms, and the big firms also have their operations, they would tend to pay to do internal transfer pricing, in the sense that they would pay the price for fish that is equal to the price that they pay within their own subdivisions, and that can be manipulated to pay as little as possible. So that also impacts the kind of profitability that you would have from the other players that are in the joint venture. And so there is a need to look into issues of fairness and of a relationship within these vertically integrated firms, and how they operate in joint ventures, and how also they don't allow the joint venture partners to come into the processing side. These are the kind of things that we captured from below. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefano. Thank you very much, Thando. I think it was really a fascinating talk. Definitely we needed more time in terms of really engaging with the paper. We do have your contact details in terms of people who want to kind of contribute to your research and maybe give you some comments on your presentation. A question was asked whether your presentation would be available to share the slides. The slides would be the webinar would be
14 hours
on YouTube, so you can see the slides. So we will also share contact details of Thando Vilakazi in terms of any comments. So thank you very much for both. I think that it is a topic, politics, I agree with you, as a very close relationship to fisheries, and the decisions that are made in the sector is political. Even if you are taking a decision that you don't want to engage into the politics or the transformation, that is political in itself. So I think it. I'm really interested in looking at the paper in terms of your when you release it in the next 2 months, and I think the working draft, the paper. And I think it is important that we engage with these topics on transformation. Transformation and Black economic empowerment and looking at the value chain, I think it's more than just the raw material. And I agree with you, Thando, that we definitely need to look at what are the criteria that needs to be in place where 15 years from now. How do we really need to see the sector? Because when I look at the sector, it still feels to me that as if it is business as usual. So thank you very much for both of you giving your presentation, and thank you for the audience for listening. Please join us next week for our next seminar. It's on water scarcity and the governance problem, looking at, again, a focus of COVID-19. My colleague Mafahara and some studio guests will be joining him. Thank you very much, and thank you all for listening. Keep well and keep safe. Bye-bye.